Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
The day before the Vance Foundation Gala, the grand foyer of the estate smelled of expensive floor wax and the cloying, sweet scent of white lilies. Clara Vance stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold wrought iron railing as she watched the frantic preparations below. This was the house she had grown up in, a place of polished surfaces and hollow hearts, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like a storm. Arthur walked into the center of the foyer, his polished Oxfords clicking sharply against the marble. He didn't look up at his daughter. He never did unless he had a demand to make. He was busy berating a young florist who had placed the centerpieces an inch off center. "It's a gala, not a funeral," Arthur snapped, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "If the Thorne family sees this level of incompetence, I'll have your business shuttered by Monday. Move them." Clara watched the florist's hands shake as the girl scrambled to obey. It was a familiar sight, a display of the casual cruelty Arthur used to maintain his gravity. She descended the stairs slowly, her movements deliberate and devoid of the hurried anxiety that usually defined her presence in this house. "The Thorne family is more interested in the accounts than the lilies, father," she said, her voice steady as she reached the marble floor. Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing as they raked over her simple linen dress. He let out a short, mocking huff, adjusting the heavy gold signet ring on his finger. "And what would you know about the Thorne interests, Clara? You've spent your life drawing blueprints for strip malls while I've been building an empire. Do yourself a favor and stay in the shadows tomorrow. I don't want Julian Thorne thinking my only heir is a glorified draftsperson." The insult was sharp, designed to draw blood, but Clara only felt a cool, detached sense of irony. She thought of the digital folder currently encrypted on her laptop, the one Julian had helped her finalize. It contained the original land deeds and the proof of the predatory loans Arthur had used to build his empire. "I think Julian might find my perspective quite refreshing," Clara replied. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the smooth, cold surface of a USB drive. It was a tactile reminder of the power she now held. "He values structural integrity, something this house has been lacking for a long time." Aunt Martha stepped out from the dining room, her face pale against her dark dress. She caught Clara's eye, a silent warning passing between them. Martha was the keeper of the family's dark financial secrets, the woman who had watched Arthur dismantle the lives of everyone around him. She knew Clara had finally found the shovel to dig up the bodies. "Arthur, the caterers need your signature on the final menu," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. Arthur waved her off, turning back to Clara with a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've decided what to do with your mother's remaining shares, by the way. Since you've shown zero aptitude for the family business, I'm folding them into the foundation tomorrow night. It'll be a grand gesture, a legacy move." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with the sheer audacity of his greed. He was planning to publicly steal the last piece of her mother's memory, a final act of erasure in front of the city's elite. "A legacy move," Clara repeated softly. "Are you sure that's wise? Foundations can be fragile, especially when they're built on someone else's land." Arthur laughed, a loud, barking sound that held no warmth. "Someone else's land? I am the Vance Foundation. Everything in this zip code belongs to me because I had the stones to take it. You do well to remember that before you start offering advice." He stepped closer, the smell of his expensive cologne, something with notes of cedar and unearned authority filling her space. "Tomorrow night, you will wear the black silk I bought you. You will stand behind me. You will smile. And you will not speak unless spoken to. Is that clear?" Clara met his gaze, refusing to blink. She saw the vanity in his posture and the deep, rotting arrogance he masked with aggression. He had no idea that Nate Vance had already signed over his proxy to her in exchange for a way out of Arthur's shadow. He had no idea that Julian Thorne wasn't coming to the gala to celebrate a partnership, but to witness a reckoning. "Perfectly clear," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded almost like a promise. Arthur grunted, satisfied by what he perceived as her usual submission. He turned on his heel and marched toward the study, shouting for Nate to bring him the Thorn contract. He walked with the confidence of a man who thought he owned the world, unaware that the floor beneath him was already beginning to give way. Clara watched him go, her expression unreadable. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a 3-word text to Julian. "The foundation is set." The reply came seconds later. "I'll bring the matches." She looked back at the lilies in the foyer. Arthur was right about one thing. It wasn't a funeral yet. But by this time tomorrow, the Vance empire would be nothing but ash, and she would be the one holding the deed to the ruins. She felt the weight of the USB drive in her pocket one last time, a secret weapon waiting for the first light of the gala. There were less than 24 hours left until the world found out who really owned the ground Arthur Vance was standing on. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study, hitting the polished mahogany desk with a glare that made Clara Vance squint. She stood by the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in her hands, watching her father. Arthur Vance didn't enter rooms, he annexed them. He marched in, Nate Vance trailing behind him like a kicked dog carrying a stack of leather-bound folders. The heavy scent of stale cigar smoke and expensive cologne preceded him, a suffocating reminder of his presence. "Sign this," he said, not looking at her. He tossed a single sheet of vellum onto the desk. The gold nib of his fountain pen scratched harshly against the silence as he uncapped it. "It's a formal relinquishment of your oversight on the Thorn merger. I don't need an architect's artistic sensibilities slowing down a billion-dollar deal." Clara set her coffee down on a coaster, her movements deliberate. She didn't reach for the pen. "The merger involves the historic district, Arthur. My designs are the only reason the city council approved the zoning." He let out a short, barking laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "The city council was bought and paid for before you finished your first sketch. Don't flatter yourself, Clara. You were a convenient face for the PR campaign. Now you're just overhead." He leaned over the desk, his knuckles turning white against the wood. "Tonight at the gala, you will wear the dress I bought you. You will stand 2 paces behind me, and you will keep your mouth shut while I announce the acquisition. You're lucky I'm still letting you keep the Vance name after the embarrassment of your last project." Nate shifted uncomfortably in the corner, his eyes darting toward the door. He knew the truth about that embarrassment. How Arthur had siphoned the project's budget into his offshore accounts and blamed Clara for the structural delays. "I've already looked at the documents," she said, her voice like a sheet of ice. She walked toward the desk, her fingers grazing the cold silver of a letter opener. "There's a clause on page 12 regarding the transfer of the legacy trusts. Aunt Martha mentioned they were untouchable." Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. "Martha is a senile old woman clinging to a dead era. Those trusts are the collateral for the Thorn expansion. I've already moved them." He shoved the pen toward her again. "Sign, now, or I'll have security escort you out of this house before the first guest arrives tonight. You'll be left with nothing but the clothes on your back." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the desperation beneath the bravado. He was drowning in debt, and he thought Julian Thorn was his life raft. She picked up the pen. The weight of it felt significant, a weapon disguised as a tool. She signed the document with a flourish, but her eyes were on the small USB drive tucked into her palm, the one Julian had encrypted for her. What Arthur didn't know was that the relinquishment form he drafted was based on an outdated corporate charter. By signing it, she wasn't giving up her power. She was triggering a succession in crisis clause that Aunt Martha had hidden in the family bylaws decades ago. The moment this paper was filed, every asset Arthur moved would be flagged for immediate audit by the Thorn Group's legal team. "There," she said, sliding the paper back. "I hope it's everything you wanted." "It's a start," he muttered, snatching the paper and handed it to Nate without a second glance. "Get this to the lawyers. I want the final contracts ready for Julian to sign the moment he walks into the ballroom tonight." Nate nodded and scurried out, leaving the room heavy with the tension of things unsaid. Arthur turned his back to her, already pulling out his phone to bark orders at a caterer. He was so consumed by the image of his own victory that he didn't notice the way Clara's hand didn't shake. He didn't see the ghost of a smile on her lips. She walked out of the study and down the long hallway, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. She pulled her phone out and checked the time. 10 hours until the gala. 10 hours until the world realized that the overlook Arthur had dismissed was actually the foundation of his ruin. She felt the weight of the secret like a diamond in her pocket, hard, sharp, and capable of cutting through everything he thought he owned. The gala wasn't just a party, it was a sentencing. And for the first time in her life, Clara was the one holding the gavel. 6 hours before the first guest was scheduled to arrive for the Vance gala, Clara Vance found herself miles away from the frantic energy of the estate. She stood in the dim, cramped hallway of a rent-controlled apartment that smelled of peppermint tea and old newspapers. Aunt Martha didn't look like a woman who held the keys to a kingdom. She looked like a retired schoolteacher, her cardigan pilled at the elbows, her eyes magnified behind thick spectacles. But as she led her niece toward a heavy oak desk in the corner, her movements were deliberate and heavy with the weight of decades. "He thinks I burned them," Martha whispered, her voice raspy but steady. "Arthur Vance thinks that because he paid for my hip surgery 10 years ago, he bought my soul. He thinks everyone has a price, Clara. He forgot that some people just have memories." She pulled a small, tarnished key from a chain around her neck and unlocked a hidden compartment at the base of the desk. From within, she withdrew a slender, leather-bound ledger. The cover was scarred, the spine cracked, but the gold-embossed initials on the front, J.T., sent a jolt of recognition through Clara. Julian Thorne's father. "The Hidden Harvest," Martha said, sliding the book across the polished wood. Clara's fingers brushed the leather, the texture cool and slightly oily against her skin. "That's what your father called it in private. It wasn't just a bad business deal that ruined the Thorne family. It was a systematic harvest of their assets, redirected into Vance shell companies before the ink on the partnership was even dry. It's all here, every forged signature, every diverted wire transfer." Clara opened the book. The scent of almond-bitter ink and decaying paper rose to meet her. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the dates matching the exact year the Thorne family had vanished from the social register. It was a roadmap of theft disguised as ambition. Her phone buzzed violently on the desk, the caller ID flashing her father's name. She didn't answer. She let it vibrate until the silence returned, thick and expectant. "He's going to announce the merger tonight," Clara said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "He's going to use Julian's current success to bail out his own failing developments. He thinks he's winning again." "He always thinks he's winning," Martha replied, her hand trembling as she rested it on Clara's. "But a harvest built on stolen seeds eventually rots. Take it. Use it. Not for me and not even for Julian. Do it for the girl you were before he convinced you that your only value was being his shadow." Clara tucked the ledger into her bag, the weight of it feeling like a whetted blade. The drive back to the estate felt like a descent into a gilded cage. As she stepped into the grand foyer, the air was thick with the cloying scent of 5,000 imported white lilies. The sound of a string quartet tuning their instruments echoed off the marble walls, a dissonant screech that set her teeth on edge. Arthur stood at the center of the ballroom, a conductor in a $10,000 tuxedo. He was barking orders at a catering captain, his face flushed with the exhilaration of impending triumph. When he spotted Clara, his expression shifted from irritation to a practiced, condescending mask of fatherly concern. "There she is," Arthur said, his voice carrying across the room to the half-dozen decorators currently draping silk over the buffet tables. "The disappearing architect. I assume you were out finding a dress that doesn't make you look like a librarian. Tonight is about optics, Clara. I need you looking like a Vance, not a charity case." A few of the decorators exchanged uncomfortable glances. Clara didn't flinch. She walked toward him, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the floor. "I was taking care of some final details, Father. I wanted to make sure everything was in its proper place." Arthur laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that didn't reach his eyes. He reached out, adjusting the collar of her coat with a proprietary flick of his fingers. Details. Leave the details to the people I pay. Your job is to stand by my side, look grateful, and smile when I introduce Julian Thorne as our new partner. Do you think you can manage that, or is the pressure of a real legacy too much for you? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to the catering captain, dismissing her presence as easily as a piece of lint on his lapel. And make sure the vintage crystal is on ice. I want the Thorne boy to taste exactly what he's been missing all these years. Clara felt the ledger pressing against her hip through the fabric of her bag. She thought of Leo Thorne, Julian's son, and the way the boy had looked at her with such earnest hope. She thought of Julian's cold, guarded eyes. Arthur was so blinded by the glare of his own reflected glory that he couldn't see the shadow falling over him. She moved toward the grand staircase, pausing at the first step. "The champagne is a good choice, Father," she said, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. "It's important to have something to toast with when the truth finally comes out." Arthur didn't even look up from his clipboard. "The only truth that matters tonight is the one I've written, Clara. Go get changed. You're late." She climbed the stairs, her hand trailing along the cold gold leaf of the banister. In her room, she laid the ledger on her vanity, right next to the invitation that bore the Vance crest. 2 hours. In 2 hours, the doors would open. In 2 hours, Julian Thorne would walk into this house, expecting a business deal. Clara picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized but never called. When the man on the other end answered, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "It's Clara Vance," she said, watching her reflection in the mirror. She didn't look like a librarian, she looked like a storm. "I have the harvest. Are you ready to reap?" The silence on the other end lasted only a second. "I've been ready for 20 years, Julian Thorne replied. Clara hung up. She looked at the clock. The countdown had reached its final arc. The gala wasn't a celebration, it was a trap, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one caught in it. She reached for her dress, the silk rustling like a warning. The harvest was hidden no longer. The hour before the gala, Clara Vance stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the house transform into a gilded cage. The air in the foyer was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and lilies, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the underlying smell of old dust and secrets. Below her, a small army of caterers moved with clinical precision, their footsteps muffled by the heavy Persian rugs that her father had bought at an auction just to prove he could. "Is that what you're wearing?" The voice was like a serrated blade. Clara didn't need to turn to know that Arthur Vance was standing in the doorway of his study. She smoothed the silk of her midnight blue gown, the fabric cool against her trembling fingers. It was a dress she had bought with her own modest savings, a far cry from the designer labels her father usually demanded she flaunt as a walking billboard for his success. "It's appropriate for the occasion, Father," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Arthur stepped into the light, his tuxedo pressed so sharply it looked lethal. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks, his eyes raking over her with the clinical detachment of an appraiser looking at a flawed diamond. "It lacks stature. You look like a librarian trying to play dress-up. Try not to stand too close to the light. You'll make the champagne look cheap." He walked toward her, the rhythmic thwack of his leather shoes on the marble sounding like a countdown. "Tonight is about the Thorne merger. Julian Thorne is coming here to finalize the deal that will secure this family for the next 50 years. I need you to be more than just a wallflower. You will sit to his right. You will smile. And for God's sake, Clara, try to look like you belong in this family." Clara felt the weight of the digital ledger hidden in the small clutch purse she held. It was a physical anchor in a world of smoke and mirrors. "Do you ever wonder if the foundation can hold all this weight?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the massive crystal chandelier hanging above the foyer. Arthur laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of any real mirth. "The foundation is gold, Clara. It doesn't break, it only grows." "Gold is soft," she countered softly. "It melts when the heat gets high enough." Her father stopped beside her, his heavy sandalwood cologne, the smell of every childhood lecture and every cold dismissal filling her lungs. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You've always had a poetic streak, a weakness inherited from your mother. But tonight is for prose. Hard, cold facts. You are the collateral for this deal, Clara. Don't forget that your little life in the archives only exists because I allow it. The insult hit like a physical blow, but Clara didn't flinch. She watched as Nate Vance stumbled into the foyer from the dining room, already smelling of gin and wearing a smirk that mirrored their father's. Nate adjusted his tie clumsily, nodding to Arthur with an unearned confidence. "Is the lamb ready for the slaughter?" Nate asked, his eyes dancing with a cruel light as he looked at Clara. "She's ready to do her duty," Arthur replied, dismissively turning his back on her. "Martha, where is that woman?" "I need the ledger from the safe." Aunt Martha appeared from the shadows of the hallway, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She glanced up at Clara, and for a fleeting second there was a flicker of something, pity, or perhaps a warning in her eyes. She carried a tray of crystal flutes, the glass chiming like a funeral bell. "The guests are beginning to arrive, Arthur," Martha said quietly. Outside, the crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires signaled the start of the end. Clara watched through the tall windows as a sleek, black sedan pulled into the circular driveway. The valet hurried forward, but the man who stepped out didn't wait for the door to be opened. "He's here," Arthur breathed, his posture straightening, his face shifting instantly into the mask of a jovial host. He didn't look back at his daughter as he descended the stairs to meet his destiny. Clara gripped her purse tighter. She thought of the voice on the phone, the low rumble of a man who had waited 20 years for this moment. She looked down at her father, who was currently practicing his handshake in the mirror of the foyer, oblivious to the fact that the man walking toward his door wasn't a partner, but an executioner. "You should have looked at the books one last time, Father," she whispered to the empty hallway. As the heavy oak doors swung open, the first cold draft of the evening swept in, extinguishing the candles on the side table. Julian Thorne stepped into the light, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He didn't look at Arthur. His eyes went straight to the top of the stairs, locking onto Clara's. The harvest had arrived. The evening arrived with a heavy, expectant silence that even the crackling fireplace in the grand dining room couldn't warm. The scent of roasted rosemary and expensive wood polish hung thick in the air, a sensory shroud over the Vance family's Thanksgiving table. Clara Vance stood by the sideboard, her fingers grazing the cool, polished silver of a serving spoon. She felt a strange, detached calm. In the foyer, she could hear the booming, performative laughter of her father as he led their guests toward the dining hall. Arthur Vance entered the room first, his chest puffed out like a conqueror returning from a successful campaign. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, every stitch screaming of a wealth that Clara knew was built on a foundation of sand and stolen promises. Behind him walked Julian Thorne, a shadow of silent, predatory elegance. Unlike Arthur's frantic energy, Julian moved with a terrifying economy of motion. His son, Leo Thorne, followed closely, his young face pale and his eyes darting toward Clara with a mix of confusion and a silent plea for recognition. "Sit, sit," Arthur barked, gesturing to the heavy oak chairs upholstered in deep crimson velvet. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the harvest. We celebrate the future of Vance Holdings. Julian, the head of the table is yours by right of partnership." "I prefer the side," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to make the crystal chandelier overhead hum. "I like to see everyone's face when I speak." He took a seat directly across from Clara. The candlelight flickered in his dark eyes, reflecting a cold fire that only she seemed to recognize. Aunt Martha sat at the far end, her pearls clicking against her collarbone as her hands shook. She wouldn't meet Clara's gaze. She knew what was buried in the ledgers upstairs, and the weight of that secret was clearly crushing her. Nate Vance, Clara's younger brother, slid into the seat next to her, smelling of expensive bourbon and nervous sweat. He leaned in, whispering, "Dad's acting like he just won the lottery. Is this Thorne guy really going to bail us out?" Clara didn't answer. She reached into the hidden pocket of her silk dress, her thumb brushing the sharp edge of a flash drive. It was her secret power, a digital guillotine waiting for the right moment to fall. "Just watch the show, Nate," she murmured. The first course was served in a tense symphony of clinking silverware. Arthur was in rare form, his arrogance reaching a fever pitch as the wine flowed. He leaned over the table, pointing a gold-encrusted fork toward Clara. "You see this, Julian?" Arthur sneered, his face flushing a mottled purple. "My daughter spent 5 years studying architecture just to design community centers for people who can't pay their bills. I told her, Clara, a Vance builds monuments, not charities. But she's always had a soft heart and a soft head to match." The table went silent. Nate looked at his plate, and Aunt Martha suddenly found the pattern on her napkin fascinating. It was a classic Arthur move, a public humiliation disguised as a fatherly anecdote. The rage spiked in Clara's chest, hot and sharp, but she didn't flinch. She simply picked up her wine glass, the cool condensation a stark contrast to the heat in her blood. "I think the people in those centers would disagree, Father," Clara said, her voice steady and dangerously quiet. "They value things that last, unlike some of your investments." Arthur's laugh was a sharp bark of derision. "Investments? Listen to her. She doesn't know a balance sheet from a grocery list. That's why I handle the legacy. Julian and I have spent the last 3 hours finalizing the merger. By Monday, the Vance name will be on every Thorn development in the tri-state area." He turned back to Julian, his eyes gleaming with greed. "I've even managed to reallocate the pension funds from the old textile division to cover the initial buy-in. It's a masterstroke. Those retirees won't even notice a dip for another decade, and by then, we'll be 10 times richer." Julian didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He merely cut a piece of turkey with surgical precision. "You're very confident in your accounting, Arthur." Most men would be afraid of the paper trail such a masterstroke leaves behind. "Paper trail?" Arthur waved a hand dismissively, nearly knocking over his wine. "I've got Martha for that. She's been scrubbing the books since before Clara could walk. Isn't that right, Martha?" The old woman let out a small, strangled sound, her face turning the color of ash. She looked at Julian, then at Clara, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "She's just tired from the cooking," Arthur continued, oblivious to the terror radiating from his sister. "The point is, Julian, you're looking at a man who knows how to take what he wants. I've spent 20 years making sure this family stayed at the top, no matter who I had to step on to get there." Clara felt the wait for it moment approaching, the tension in the room stretching like a piano wire ready to snap. She caught Julian's eye. For a split second, the mask of the cold billionaire slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man who had waited 2 decades for this Thanksgiving. He gave her a microscopic nod. Arthur stood up, his glass raised high. "A toast to Julian Thorne, the man who recognized a winner when he saw one. And to the Vance legacy, may it grow even larger on the backs of those too weak to keep what's theirs." He looked around the table, his chest heaving with pride, waiting for the others to join him. Nate hesitantly lifted his glass. Aunt Martha's hand wobbled so violently the wine spilled onto the white linen. Julian remained seated. He didn't reach for his glass. Instead, he leaned back, the shadows of the room seeming to lengthen around him. "It's an interesting toast, Arthur, but I think we should wait for the guest of honor to arrive before we drink." Arthur's brow furrowed in confusion. "Guest of honor? What are you talking about? Everyone's here." "Not everyone," Clara said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. She looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was exactly 8:00 p.m. At that moment, the heavy front doors of the mansion groaned open. The sound of firm, rhythmic footsteps echoed through the foyer, heading straight for the dining room. Arthur's face went from confusion to a sudden, sharp flicker of alarm. "Who the hell is that?" Arthur demanded, turning toward the doorway. Julian finally smiled, a slow, terrifying expression that didn't reach his eyes. "That Arthur is the man you thought you buried 20 years ago, and he's brought the real ledgers with him." The door swung wide, and a man in a dark suit stepped into the light, holding a heavy leather-bound folder. Arthur's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. The crimson wine spread across the floor like a fresh wound, soaking into the expensive rug as the color drained completely from his face. Julian stood up, his presence suddenly suffocating. "Now," he whispered, "shall we talk about the harvest?" The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drip of red wine falling from the edge of the mahogany table. Arthur Vance stood frozen, his hand still shaped as if it held the glass that now lay in 100 glittering shards at his feet. The man in the dark suit didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped forward, the heavy leather-bound folder thudding onto the table with a finality that made the silverware jump. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The air in the room had already shifted, thickening with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of his rival's rising panic. "Open it, Arthur," Julian said, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "Page 42. The offshore accounts you thought were buried under 20 years of shell companies and forged signatures." Arthur's face underwent a violent, silent transformation. The ruddy, self-assured mask of the patriarch didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His jaw worked soundlessly, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed his sudden terror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, grayish pallor that made his expensive tan look like cheap stage makeup. His eyes, usually sharp with calculation, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the leather-bound book as if it were a coiled viper. Sweat began to bead at his hairline, thick drops tracking through his carefully groomed silver hair, while his nostrils flared in a desperate, shallow hunt for air he couldn't seem to find. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a cornered animal realizing the trap had been set decades ago. This is a fabrication," Arthur finally wheezed, though his voice lacked any conviction. He reached for the table to steady himself, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Aunt Martha's hand flew to her throat, her pearls clicking against her trembling fingers as she peered at the documents. "Arthur, is that your signature on the Thorne acquisition?" Her voice was a thin, brittle reed. "You told us that money was lost in the crash." Clara Vance stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the ledger. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at her father. The realization of his rot, the years of manipulation and greed she had unknowingly enabled, finally crystallized into a cold, hard diamond of clarity. She felt the weight of her family name suddenly become an unbearable burden. Across the table, Nate Vance leaned back, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood as he looked at his father with a mixture of pity and profound revulsion. Even the maid in the doorway stood motionless, her eyes wide as the myth of the great Arthur Vance crumbled in real time. Julian Thorne leaned in, his presence suddenly suffocating the small space between them. He smelled of cold air and expensive cedar, a stark contrast to the cloying, fermented scent of the spilled Cabernet. "My father died believing he was a failure because of what you stole," he whispered, the words cutting through the room like a blade. "But he kept a duplicate set of books, Arthur. He knew you'd come for the harvest eventually. He just didn't know I'd be the one to reap it." The older man tried to speak, to lash out with the practiced arrogance that had served him for 60 years, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but Martha had turned her head away, and Clara's gaze was as unforgiving as a winter frost. He was alone in a room full of people who finally saw him for exactly what he was. Julian straightened his jacket, his expression smoothing into one of professional indifference. He had spent 20 years dreaming of this moment, yet his heart rate remained steady, his pulse a calm, rhythmic beat of justice. He reached out and tapped the ledger one last time. "You always told Clara that people like me don't belong in your world," Julian said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent mansion. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on theft and shadows. That's why I'm taking it all back." He turned on his heel, the man in the dark suit following him without a word. Julian didn't look back as he crossed the foyer, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the marble floors he now legally owned. He left Arthur standing in the wreckage of his own legacy, surrounded by the smell of sour wine and the deafening silence of a family that no longer knew his name. The silence in the foyer didn't just break, It shattered under the weight of Arthur Vance's ragged breathing. For a heartbeat, the guests stood like statues, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips, eyes darting between the disgraced patriarch and the ledger that had just stripped him of his empire. The air in the mansion felt suddenly thin, smelling of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of a looming storm. Arthur's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The ruddy, self-assured mask he had worn for decades didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His skin, usually flush with the arrogance of a man who owned every room he entered, turned a sickly, translucent gray, like wet parchment. A frantic pulse throbbed at the base of his throat, visible and erratic. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, darted with a wild, cornered energy, losing their focus as they skipped over the documents Julian had presented. His mouth hung slightly agape, the lower lip trembling with a silent, rhythmic twitch that he seemed powerless to control. The deep-set lines around his nose tightened into a sneer of pure, unadulterated terror, and for the first time he looked every bit of his 70 years, brittle, hollowed out, and utterly defeated. "This is a fabrication," Arthur finally wheezed, his voice cracking like dry timber. He lunged toward the table, his fingers clawing at the air as if he could physically snatch his power back from the mahogany surface. "Clara, tell this. This interloper that he's delusional, I built this. Every stone, every cent." Clara Vance didn't move. She stood beside Julian, her spine a straight line of cold resolve. She felt the weight of the moment, the decades of her father's gaslighting and manipulation finally curdling into this singular point of justice. She looked at the man who had demanded her total submission, and for the first time, she felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. "You didn't build it, Father," Clara said, her voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the murmuring guests. "You stole it. You traded Julian's father's life for a seat at a table that was never yours to sit at. I'm not your shield anymore." "You ungrateful little brat," Arthur roared, his face suddenly flaring a dangerous, bruised purple. He turned to the crowd, his hands shaking. Nate, call security. Get this trash out of my house." Nate Vance stepped forward from the shadow of the grand staircase, but he didn't move toward the door. He looked at the documents, then at his father, his expression one of profound realization. He reached out and picked up a single sheet, the notarized transfer of the Vance holdings. "It's over, Dad," Nate said, his voice flat. He looked at the guests, many of whom were already beginning to set their drinks down on any available surface, their faces twisted in a mixture of scandal and dawning disgust. "The signatures are valid. I checked the filings an hour ago when I saw the first alert on the internal server. Julian isn't an intruder. He's the owner." Aunt Martha moved then, the sharp click of her heels on the marble sounding like a series of small explosions. She didn't go to Arthur's side. Instead, she walked straight to Clara and Julian. She reached into her silk clutch and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key, the one to the basement vault Arthur had kept under a biometric lock for 20 years. "He kept the original ledgers there," Aunt Martha said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "The ones that prove the embezzlement started long before the Thorn merger. I've been waiting for someone strong enough to take this from him." The betrayal from within his own inner circle seemed to be the final blow. Arthur stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of a Persian rug. He gripped the marble banister, his knuckles white and trembling. The very house seemed to be rejecting him. The warmth of the lights felt harsh, exposing the fraud beneath the tailored suit. "You can't do this," Arthur hissed, looking at Julian. "I have friends. I have influence." "You had assets," Julian Thorne corrected him, his tone as cold as a winter morning. "And assets can be seized. As for your friends, look around the room, Arthur. They aren't your friends. They were your audience. And the show is over." As if on cue, the dark-suited man who had followed Julian stepped forward, producing a legal notice. "Mr. Vance, you have exactly 20 minutes to gather your personal effects. Security is already stationed at the gates. Any attempt to remove company property, including the art, the vehicles, or the wine cellar, will be met with immediate criminal charges." The guests began to filter out, their whispers filling the foyer like the buzzing of flies. No one stopped to offer Arthur a hand. No one looked him in the eye. They moved past him as if he were a piece of furniture that had suddenly become an eyesore. Clara watched as Nate guided Aunt Martha toward the door, leaving her alone with Julian and the shell of the man who had once been her world. She stepped closer to Arthur, her shadow falling over his slumped form. "You always told me that people like me don't belong in your world," Clara said, repeating the words he had used to humiliate her at dinner just weeks ago. "You were right. I don't belong in a world built on theft and shadows. That's why I'm taking the light with me." She turned and walked toward the door, her hand finding Julian's. He squeezed her fingers, a silent anchor in the wake of the destruction. They didn't look back as they crossed the threshold, leaving Arthur Vance standing in the center of his empty kingdom, surrounded by the smell of sour wine and the deafening silence of a legacy that had turned to ash. Behind them, the heavy oak doors groaned shut, the sound of the latch clicking into place final and absolute. 6 months later, the morning light in the glass-walled studio felt different than the heavy, filtered sun of the old estate. It was cleaner, sharper, and smelled faintly of rain and expensive drafting paper. Clara Vance stood before a sprawling mahogany table, her fingers tracing the skeletal lines of her latest project. A community library designed to breathe life back into the district her father had once tried to raise for a luxury high-rise. The blueprints felt crisp under her touch, a tactile reminder of a world she was finally building on her own terms. Julian Thorne stepped into the room, the soft click of his leather soles against the polished concrete floor signaling his arrival. He didn't interrupt. He simply leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a quiet intensity that no longer felt like a challenge but a sanctuary. He held 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling into the air between them. "The board approved the final renderings," he said, his voice low and steady. He walked over, setting a cup near her hand. "They're calling it the most ambitious civic project the city has seen in a decade. You've done it, Clara." She offered him a small, weary smile. It was a victory, certainly, but it didn't carry the frantic heat of her earlier triumphs. It felt like a slow, deep breath. "It's a start," she replied, her gaze drifting to the window. Below, the city was a hum of motion, a living thing that no longer felt like a chessboard for her to master. The door to the outer office opened, and Leo Thorne skidded inside, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The boy had grown an inch over the summer, his face losing some of its guarded caution. He headed straight for the drafting table, peering at the 3D model of the library. "Is this where the garden goes?" Leo asked, pointing to a recessed courtyard in the miniature. "Exactly there," she said, ruffling his hair, "with the oak trees we talked about." The domesticity of the moment was interrupted by the arrival of Aunt Martha. She looked younger than she had in years, dressed in a sharp navy suit that signaled her new role as the head of the Vance Foundation's charitable arm. She carried a thick manila envelope, but her expression wasn't one of business. It was one of lingering, uncomfortable pity. "I thought you should see the final liquidation report," Martha said, placing the envelope on the corner of the desk. She hesitated, then added, "I saw him yesterday. Arthur." The room seemed to chill by a few degrees. Clara didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't need to see the numbers to know the extent of the collapse. After the fraud was exposed, the Vance empire hadn't just fallen. It had been dismantled by a swarm of creditors and federal investigators. "How is he?" Clara asked, the question feeling like a ghost in her throat. "He's living in a 1-bedroom rental in the Heights," Martha said, her voice tinged with a grim sort of irony. "The kind of place he used to call a glorified shoebox. He tried to get a table at the Sterling Grill last Tuesday. They told him they were fully booked, even though half the room was empty. He made a scene, shouting about who he was, until security had to escort him to the sidewalk." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. She could see it perfectly. Arthur Vance standing on a public street, his designer suit fraying at the cuffs, clutching a legacy that had turned to ash. The man who had once commanded rooms with a whisper was now a punchline in the very circles he had helped create. It was the face slap that never ended, a perpetual public reminder that his power had been an illusion sustained by the fear of others. Now that the fear was gone, there was nothing left but a bitter old man in a cheap apartment. "Nate Vance called me, too," Martha continued. "He's working as a junior clerk in a firm upstate. He asked if you'd ever take his call. I told him not to hold his breath." Clara nodded slowly. The justice was proportional, but it wasn't painless. She had won her freedom, her career, and a family built on choice rather than blood, but the cost remained etched in the quiet moments. She had lost the father she thought she had, replaced by the reality of a monster she had been forced to slay. The Vance name was no longer a crown, it was a scar. Julian reached out, his hand covering hers on the edge of the drafting table. "You don't owe that shadow anything more, Clara." She looked at the model of the library, then at Julian and Leo. The weight of the past was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it no longer dictated her direction. She picked up the liquidation report and walked it over to the shredder in the corner. The machine hummed to life, devouring the last remnants of her father's greed in a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks. "I know," she said, turning back to the light of the window. She had taken the light with her, just as she had promised. But as she watched the city move below, she realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing Arthur fall. It was the fact that she no longer needed to look back to see if he was watching. She was finally, irrevocably, out of his reach.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.